We all know anime has totally blown up, right? It's a massive global force. But behind that boom, there's a really fascinating story about two different groups of people: the folks who actually make the stuff and the fans who live and breathe it. And, as we're about to see, both of them are going through some pretty huge changes.
Yeah, this is the big paradox, the weird problem right at the center of the entire industry. We see the incredible success, all the merch, the packed conventions, but so often that money just isn't flowing back to the animation studios. So you've got to ask yourself, how is that even possible? So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we're going to go behind the scenes and unpack the kind of crazy financial system that creators are stuck with. Then we're going to flip the script and look at the story outside the screen, at the often misunderstood identity of the otaku fan, and how that very identity is being completely redefined from the inside out.
All right, let's dive into the first part, the story inside the screen. We're talking about the money, the system, and the artists who bring these incredible shows to life.
I mean, you really can't overstate how huge this is. You have studios like MAPPA pumping out these absolute cultural juggernauts like Chainsaw Man and Jujutsu Kaisen. We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. But the real question is, who is that money for?
Well, for the longest time, the answer has been tangled up in this old, kind of broken system for how anime gets paid for. It was originally designed to lower the risk for everyone, but what it's really ended up doing is cutting the artists out of the rewards.
Okay, so it's called a production committee. And look, on paper, it kind of makes sense. You get a bunch of different investors together, think publishers, TV networks, toy companies, and they all throw money into a pot to fund a new show. This way, the animation studio doesn't have to risk its own money if the show turns out to be a dud. Sounds good, right? But here's where it all goes wrong for the studios. The investors give the studio a fixed budget, and it's often barely enough to get the job done. But here's the real kicker. If that show becomes a worldwide smash hit, the studio sees basically none of that extra profit. Their paycheck stays the same. The investors on the committee, they get to keep almost all of it. And you don't have to take my word for it. The veteran producer Hiromichi Shizume just lays it out perfectly. He calls it a system where only the investors profit. The creators are basically treated like hired help, not like actual partners in what could be a huge global success. But what if that system, which has been around for decades, is finally starting to crack? There's a new player in town, and they are bringing some seriously deep pockets to the game. Yep, I'm talking about the huge streaming companies like Netflix. They're starting to go directly to the animation studios, completely bypassing that old committee system. This new model can mean way bigger budgets, more creative freedom, and maybe even a piece of the profits if the show does well. It's a game changer, a shift from being a contractor to being a real partner. So that's the massive shift happening behind the screen. But there's a just as fascinating change happening on the other side, with the fans themselves. For years, the most passionate fans have been slapped with this label that honestly carries a lot of negative baggage: otaku. In Japan, otaku has for a long time been a word for an obsessive fan, but it often comes with this assumption that you're socially awkward. It's sometimes even connected to this more extreme term, hikikomori, which describes someone who is completely withdrawn from society, a phenomenon that gets talked about like it's some kind of social sickness. These labels have built up a really powerful and, frankly, pretty unfair stereotype. But here's the really incredible part. The very media that these fans love is starting to push back against those stereotypes. And there's no better example than the character Sakura Futaba from the amazing video game Persona 5.
So sociologists have kind of identified these 4 unwritten social rules that otaku are always accused of breaking. That they choose fantasy over real life, that they avoid social situations, they enjoy things that aren't for their gender, and they're into niche stuff instead of mainstream pop culture. Futaba, our character, she breaks every single one of those rules.
And that's exactly what makes her story so amazing. The game doesn't just show her as a stereotype, it actually digs into the why behind her actions, and it completely reframes her so-called weaknesses into incredible strengths. Her journey begins from a place of just immense trauma. She blames herself for her mother's tragic death, and this overwhelming guilt just swallows her whole, making her shut herself off from the entire world. She becomes a hikikomori, and she literally starts to think of herself as one of the living dead, someone who just doesn't deserve to be alive. And the game has this brilliant way of showing us what's going on in her head. In the game's world, which reflects people's inner minds, her twisted self-image literally becomes a giant sealed pyramid, a tomb.
It's such a powerful metaphor for how she's been psychologically trapped by her own guilt.
But then we get to the turning point. With some help from her friends, she finally confronts that trauma and starts to heal. And as she does, something just amazing happens. All those skills she developed while she was in isolation, her incredible hacking abilities, they become her superpower. She goes from being a shut-in to being the mission-critical guide for her entire team.
And this, for me, is the most profound part of her story. Her time in isolation is totally reframed. It's not seen as a social failure anymore, but as a necessary protective cocoon. It was the safe space she needed to work through this unbelievable grief, and in the end, find the strength to face the truth and rejoin the world, but this time on her own terms.
So what do we have? We've got this story of an economic revolution for the creators on one hand, and a story of a cultural reevaluation for the fans on the other. So how in the world do these two things connect? Well, it's actually pretty simple when you think about it. As the creators and studios get more financial freedom and more creative control, they can start to tell more complicated, more empathetic stories. They can finally move past the old, tired stereotypes and create characters like Futaba who actually reflect the complex inner lives of their audience with real nuance and respect. The power shift happening behind the scenes is what makes this new, deeper storytelling possible.
Which leaves us with this one big final question. With creators getting more power and the characters they create getting so much more depth, it feels like this whole culture is at a tipping point. One side is finally gaining economic strength, and the other is gaining cultural respect. So are we actually watching the beginning of a brand new golden age for both anime and its fans?